I'll turn things right over to today's moderator, Jim Levitt, who's the director of the Program on Conservation Innovation at the Harvard Forest. Jim.
Thank you, Jim. I want to welcome you all to today's internet broadcast and give you the scene where some of us are sitting right now. We're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The sun is shining. It's Harvard commencement day, so there are brilliantly dressed crowds out on the street, and the Red Sox are winning. So everyone's happy on this end. We're also happy because in the last week there has been an exciting launch of a new study that's come from the Harvard Forest called Wildlands and Woodlands, a Vision for the New England Forests. And today's session of the Conservation Finance Forum internet broadcast is focused on that new study and what it may mean for New England. We have two guests today. One guest is virtual and one guest is with us live. The virtual guest is Theodore Roosevelt IV. Mr. Roosevelt is the great-grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt and himself both a registered member of the Republican Party and an active conservationist. He was kind enough to come to Cambridge about a week ago and give a very nice introduction to David Foster's presentation on Wildlands and Woodlands. So what we're going to propose to do with you today is a first, at least on this series, which is to use video to bring you Mr. Roosevelt's keynote introduction of David Foster, and then we will turn it over to David. Pardon our experimental nature here. There, you'll see a watermark for a piece of software that will be there throughout the presentation, and we appreciate the ability to use that software, so we're happy to have that. And I'm going to let Jim Cooney now bring up in just a second Theodore Roosevelt's tape, and then we will all join on YouTube to see that. Let me say, by means of introduction for Mr. Roosevelt, that he has had an active career in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He is a Navy SEAL, or a former Navy SEAL. He served the United States Department of State in Ouagadougou, in the nation that's now known as Burkina Faso. He has served on numerous nonprofit boards, including at present the Pew Center for Climate Change, and he is a managing director at Barclays Capital, where he focuses on that investment bank's activities, both in climate change and in new clean technologies.
Well, Jim, thank you for such an incredibly generous introduction. In fact, it's so generous I'm going to retire because nobody else can meet it. You know, I wish professors were as kind to me as when I was a student as you've been here today. Somehow, they weren't quite so persuaded of my merits. I plan to be more honest today than is usual for this type of ceremonial role. But I believe this project, Wildlands and Woodlands, merits more than usual platitudes. For some time, and perhaps less notice in my environmental work, I've also worked with America's rural communities on some of their issues, including their grievances with the environmental community. So when Jim Levitt first told me about this project, I was skeptical. I asked him some hard, if not downright uncongenial questions. I was not certain that an Ivy League college, even my Ivy, would have the capacity to work from ground up with diverse communities, or would have the capacity to overcome the growing distrust among American people for what they consider the policy elite. I had visions of a new invasive species headed the New England forest from the west, those now famous bumper stickers that Western rural people fixed on every truck. Are you an environmentalist, or do you work for a living? So I grilled Jim. He took that grilling, and I thought he's either very tough or they're onto a good thing. Maybe it's both. Then I started to read. The more I read about this idea, the more I liked, such that I feel quite honored to have any small part in its rollout. The first thing that struck me when I read the New York Times piece on this project was that Dr. Foster sure likes to walk, and he was smart enough to take a New York Times writer along with him. That is right out of the Teddy Roosevelt playbook. The old lion loved nothing better than taking friends and opponents alike out into the woods and exhausting all argument out of them. Even John Burroughs once complained, describing a bird walk with the president as a forced march. This walking penchant of Dr. Foster's seems to me emblematic of his entire approach. According to the Times, Dave feels that we need to get back into the woods on an everyday basis with both walking stick and axe. Dr. Foster envisaged a working woodland in New England anchored around state and federal wildlands. Working woodlands mean that the communities would harvest at least some of the wood products from their own backyard versus exporting deforestation to more vulnerable forests. A working woodland means that the forest owners would be compensated for CO2 sequestering benefits, and apparently the Harvard School of Forestry has discovered that is considerable in our New England forests. A working woodland means that owners would be compensated for foregoing certain development rights. And finally, a working woodland keeps our water healthy without expensive infrastructure and our communities refreshed in every sense of the word. This is about property values, ecological values, and community values. It is about our particular corner of the world. It is about place values. There has long been a duality in our country between liberty and community. We react poorly to anyone thinking they are better than the rest and presuming to tell the rest what to do. But our individualism and fierce love of liberty isn't enough to keep our democracy healthy. It requires joining together. It requires a vigorous engagement with one another. What is becoming increasingly clear to me is that we work out this duality best when we work it out as close to the ground as possible in what a good friend of mine, a Western writer, Dan Kemmis, calls place-based democracy. There is nothing more powerful than when the American people freely join together around a vision for themselves and their neighbors. This, in fact, is a New England tradition. It began 400 years ago when the founders of Boston did something extraordinary for a revolutionary inclined people. Long before their heirs brewed up a tax revolt against empire, Bostonians took the unprecedented step of self-taxation for conservation. They taxed themselves in order to purchase the first public park in the English-speaking world, the Boston Commons. Later, they would also found this university. This was not a tax or a mandate imposed from afar. This was a vision, embraced by the people, paid for the people, regulated by the people, and maintained by the people. No one should underestimate the American people's ability to pitch remote overlords into the briny, even those only so far away as D.C. But neither should we underestimate our ability to come together to manage our own business and protect our community interests. We cannot impair choice without rousing Americans, but we can work with communities to lend information and support towards larger goals. We need a new kind of leadership in the conservation community, leadership that can hold a vision for the present and future that is not coercive, but a vision shaped by the community and its values, leadership that can walk out onto the fruited plain once again and find its way home to the American people. If you don't care about the people, it's almost guaranteed you'll lose the resource. As a Scottish thinker, Raymond Roussel, wrote, "It will be a sign we are beginning to think in some necessary ways when we can conceive of ecology and economics becoming, as they ought to be, a single discipline." Wildlands and Woodlands is one of the best documents that I've seen in a long time because it does not impose itself on New England. It braces and strengthens this place. In aligning economic and ecological values, it is heart and soul New England, the home of the conservative revolutionary. Now, let's let Dr. Foster speak for himself.
Thank you for staying with us in that new frontier of technology. I have the pleasure of reintroducing to you David Foster, who has been my colleague at the Harvard Forest for 10 years now. David is the director of the Harvard Forest and a long-term ecological research program director at Harvard and a respected member of the ecological community in the United States. Wildlands and Woodlands is really the product of many authors' work, but David has spearheaded this since its beginning in 2005, and he's really inspired us all. So, David, are you there?
I am, Jim.
I will turn it over to you and your presentation on Wildlands and Woodlands.
Okay, thanks very much. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge two groups of people. The first is the group of 19 co-authors who joined me in putting together this effort. They come from across New England, from the northern forest lands of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and even New York, down to southern New England states of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and even include a few outliers in Virginia and Minnesota. But it's through the effort of many individuals from many institutions and many states that makes this a truly regional report and regional effort. However, the vision that the authors are putting forth is really only an aspiration that can only be advanced by the actions of many landowners, organizations, companies, and agencies whose lives are dedicated in part or whole to the conservation of our land and our resources. A lot of these individuals and groups and the number of people in the audience today, and certainly in the audience last week when we released this report, provided comments and a lot of good feedback on the development of this vision and have helped make it is what it is today. It'll only be through the ongoing engagement of many individuals in all of these groups that this vision or any of our aspirations for conservation will be advanced. So I'd like to start with a historical perspective because it is history that drives and inspires our effort in conservation. You know, over the past 300 years or so, New England and almost all of the eastern U.S. has undergone a remarkable transformation. There was an early history of deforestation and conversion of largely ancient forests to farmland. And then in the mid-19th century, the region began to reforest naturally as broad-scale agriculture shifted westward and New England itself began to industrialize. But today, forest covers almost 80% of New England, and that makes the region simultaneously one of the most heavily forested parts of the U.S. and one of its most thickly settled, especially here in southern New England. This history, which environmental author Bill McKibben described as an explosion of green and one of America's great environmental stories, actually gives us an unprecedented opportunity. We have the second chance to determine the fate of our forests and our landscape. The first time that New Englanders confronted this forested landscape, they largely cut it down, but history has given us an opportunity to act differently today. But having seen that long course of history, if we look to the right hand of this graph, we can see that, like the rest of the eastern U.S. and eastern North America, New England faces a major challenge. We have a tremendous amount of forest, but we're not adequately conserving it. So even in the face of global environmental change, we identify this, the direct impact of humans through deforestation and degradation of our forest, to be the greatest threats to our forest. For the first time in more than a century and a half, forest cover is declining all across New England. So if we look broadly at the maps, we can see how this story is playing out. Across most of the region, the direct threat, the foremost threat to our forests is conversion to residential and commercial use, something that I like to call hard deforestation. I use this term because although colonial deforestation and the harvesting and burning that went along with it degraded the natural landscape, It was a soft deforestation in the sense that when the pastures and fields were abandoned, they rapidly reverted back to forest. Today, as we can see, human activity on the map on the left, which shows population change, human activity is spreading across this large forested region and perforating our continuous forests with many structures. The map on the right shows a projection by the U.S. Forest Service project, the Forest on the Edge. And this group of individuals put together this map for our report, and it projects what the future deforestation might look like across New England over the next 30 years or so. What we can see is that from southern Maine through Fairfield County, Connecticut, up through western Vermont to the region around Burlington, we're facing really rampant deforestation. This conversion represents a hard deforestation in which forests are replaced by buildings, concrete, and asphalt, and none of this will readily revert back to forest. A second threat that's facing our forests is the ongoing and rapid change in ownership. Ownership shifts are often associated with a decrease in the size of forest tracts, a change in management activity, and, of course, the potential for ongoing development and deforestation. A decline in forest ownerships reduces the efficiency of management, whether that's for wood products, for wildlife habitat, or for any other conservation objective. So we included in our report this set of maps to illustrate that this process of changing ownership, which is occurring across New England, is taking place even in our most heavily forested regions, in the region which is most important for the production of forest resources. These maps show that from 1994 to 2009 that Maine, especially northern Maine, has seen almost a complete change in ownership pattern. Shown on the left in red and pink is the historical ownership by large forest industry and a few old families, which on the right, largely in blue, has shifted to almost a complete change to ownership by institutional, corporate, and private owners. This ownership pattern, like all the ownership changes that are occurring across New England, represents an active threat, but of course it also represents an opportunity for conservation. So we look and stand back and look broadly at the New England landscape. We can see that from an environmental perspective, there are at least two really remarkable sides to the history of our countryside. The first on the left is what I've just been describing, which is the incredible cover of forest. And on the right, we see an incredible endeavor by many humans over a century or more, which is a legacy of conservation. A tremendous amount of forest and farmland that's owned by individuals, organizations, companies, agencies, and institutions of a variety of types that is permanently conserved and protected from deforestation. This is a remarkable legacy, but if we look closely at the map on the right, we can see that the extent and distribution of this conservation land is really inadequate. It's inadequate to retain the kind of extensive and connected and continuous forest areas that we need to support nature and the movement of plants and animals, especially in the face of climate change. It's inadequate to support human recreational needs, which are increasing as population and interest grow. And it's inadequate to continue to provide the many benefits that come, oftentimes without any recognition to us as individuals and societies. And so it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time just recounting what some of those benefits are. There are, of course, the really powerful and important economic benefits that come from a variety of activities, especially the production of wood products and many associated wood-related products that come from farms as well as forests. And of course, our forest landscape and this conservation matrix that we're seeking to increase is incredibly important for providing the basis for one of the most important industries in every New England state, which is tourism. But beyond these direct benefits and direct economic returns, there's a whole range of indirect benefits that come from our forests. These are oftentimes called ecosystem services, but in the Wildlands and Woodlands report, we choose to describe these as natural infrastructure, something that we as individuals in society need to invest in order to support our lives and our livelihood. This includes the ability of all regions of New England, but regions like in Massachusetts, the Quabbin forest landscape, to provide water for society. Approximately 80% of the population of New England obtains their drinking water from forested watersheds, and here in Massachusetts, 40% of the population and most of metropolitan Boston derives water that comes from this Quabbin landscape, a conservation landscape that's actively managed, provides recreational benefits, and provides incredibly clean drinking water. These benefits, along with clean air and a healthy environment, come to every part of New England from our forests. One globally important role of our forest infrastructure is to take up and store carbon. Our forests across the region are largely young and maturing. Because of that, they're growing rapidly, and they accumulate carbon by taking in carbon dioxide and storing it as wood above ground and as carbon in a variety of forms below ground. The panel at the upper right here on the screen shows the world's largest or longest continuous record of carbon uptake in a forest. It comes right here from the Harvard Forest in a study that's conducted by Steve Wofsy, a professor, and Bill Munger in the Department of Earth and Planetary Studies at Harvard. When you take these kinds of results and recognize the ongoing uptake and storage of carbon in this forest and extend them across the entire region, it becomes clear that New England is playing an important role globally in mitigating the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and thereby reducing the rate of climate change. Interestingly, if you look carefully at this graph, you can see something else, that although this is a mature forest, trees in this forest are up to 150 years of age, it's clear that the rate of carbon uptake is actually increasing and has been increasing for the last 5 to 8 years. This underscores an important point, which is that old forests and maturing forests continue to grow rapidly and continue to be incredibly important mechanisms for storing carbon and providing a range of other amenities. One of the major research questions that faces us all across this region is, how long will this process continue, and will we continue to see this increase in carbon uptake, and if so, for how long before this levels off as this forest gets increasingly older? Beyond the local and global range, New England forests play an incredibly important role nationally and at a continental scale. We oftentimes think, especially those of us in the East and in New England, which is so heavily, we oftentimes think of the U.S. as a forested country. But in fact, forest cover across the nation is a little bit over 30%, and forests are largely concentrated in the East, the Rockies, and the far West, extending up through the Pacific Northwest up into Alaska. The eastern forests are certainly substantial, and therefore they do play an incredibly important role as one key mechanism in restricting the rate of carbon increase in the atmosphere, as I've just described. But if you look at this map, it's also very clear that the forests of New York and New England also play a huge role as a connection between the large forest areas stretching down the Appalachians to the southeast and the big forests that extend up into the boreal forest northward through the maritime provinces of Canada and then across the vast boreal region all the way over to Alaska. Now, we can all attempt in a variety of ways to quantify economically and scientifically the values and roles of our forests, but the reality is that one of the most compelling human benefits of trees and forests in the New England region is that they form a backdrop to our lives. They frame our communities, whether these are urban, coastal, agricultural, or extremely rural, and they help to define for us what is meant by New England and being a New Englander. And so it's in order to seize on the historic opportunities, to address the threats that face our forests, and to retain and enhance the many benefits that trees and forests provide that we've developed the Wildlands and Woodlands vision. The report that we released envisions a long-term and sustained conservation effort to retain at least 70% of New England in forest land that's permanently free from development. This vision essentially identifies the following objectives: to protect up to 30 million acres of New England out of the existing 33 million acres of forests, which include, of course, extensive waters and wetlands. To support the retention or increase the extent of agriculture and farmland. And, of course, to accommodate but not necessarily advocate for up to a doubling of the area of development. The connection between farms and forests is intertwined and lengthy in New England history. Farming in New England, like forestry, provides local products, it enhances rural communities, it provides critical habitat, and it generates a pastoral landscape that complements forest land as part of New England's cultural heritage and as part of an incredibly important habitat. But importantly, the Wildlands and Woodlands vision is about people and nature. In order for us to live well, individually and in our local communities and as an effective and productive society, we need to conserve nature while continually reinventing and improving the manner in which we live with our environment. So even with its bold goals for conservation of forests and farmland, the Wildlands and Woodlands vision would allow for up to a doubling of the current extent of land that's directly developed for human use. So collectively, this is a vision about forests and trees, about sustaining society through natural resources and products that come from our land, and providing people with options for productive lives into the future. And so, what would this look like some 50 years hence? Well, quite clearly, this Wildlands and Woodlands vision would play out differently across the region, as it would be determined by decisions that are made and priorities that are set by individual landowners, local communities, the current conditions and extent of forests, and the broader interests of society. What we've done with this map on the screen is to frame what this might look like using the percentages that I just described and working with the current extent of forest across the region. You can see that urban areas would retain and increase tree cover. Every part of New England would have substantial forest cover, and most regions would be close to large areas of continuous forest. But the important point is that although this is a regional vision, it would necessarily play out locally, as dictated by local interests and interests of private landowners. The broad approach to conservation that we envision would not be top-down and would not be focused on fee purchase or acquisition by public entities, but rather on the establishment of conservation easements in the land of willing and motivated landowners who would sell or oftentimes donate all or part of their development rights. And so a major question is, in this future, in this vision, how would the lands be managed? Well, we're certainly not at all in our report prescriptive about stewardship or the treatment of forests, as this clearly needs to be determined by the landowners themselves. But we do envision that forest land will fall into two broad and what we view as highly complementary categories. The first and by far the most predominant would be woodlands, forests that are managed in an environmentally sound fashion for many different objectives: timber and other wood products, wildlife and habitat, aesthetics, recreation, and private and public enjoyment. This would, of course, include forests from our most rural to our most urban. Woodlands would comprise something on the order of 27 million acres or approximately 63% of the total of the New England region. But it's important to note, as you see in the graph in the center bottom, that while the need for forest products are increasing across the region, timber supplies in New England are also increasing. Consequently, there is the opportunity to retain active forest management across existing areas and to increase it in many parts of the region. For many reasons, we believe that the production of local resources is an important and environmentally sound direction that New England needs to embrace. The second broad approach to management that we advocate in our report is wildland reserves. These are large, continuous landscapes of forests, wetlands, streams, ponds, lakes that are allowed to develop naturally under the prevailing environment and free from the direct impacts of human activity. Wildlands, we envision, would comprise something like 10% of the forest cover, or about 3 million acres, and 7% of the New England landscape. Wildlands are critical to nature and to people. They help to restore one of the most common forest landscapes that greeted the first European settlers in the region, and one of the scarcest forest types in the region today, old-growth forests. Wildland reserves comprise valuable habitat for plants and animals. They support important natural processes and dynamics, and they provide unique human experience. Together, wildlands and woodlands are mutually supporting and complementary approaches to forest stewardship. Individually, they provide landowners with a full range of management options, and they deliver individually and collectively valuable benefits and opportunities. Together, they yield a diverse landscape that can best support nature and humans and help both address future changes in the environment. So in order to achieve the wildlands and woodlands vision over the next 50 years, we would need to double the rate of land conservation. Now, while this seems and clearly is a daunting prospect, we believe that it's both feasible and economically prudent. It's a goal that represents a wise investment in the future. This goal would be advanced by utilizing the remarkable conservation capacity that currently exists in our agencies, organizations, and individuals, by advancing effective approaches to broad-scale conservation, and by developing new strategies for conservation finance. We need to improve and apply our policy and planning tools and options, and we need to adjust the distribution of our activity across the land to be more efficient in terms of energy use and environmental impact. One approach that can be taken, as shown here, is the development of regional conservation partnerships. This is collections of existing groups that get together, agencies and organizations, individuals, to advance conservation across regions that they identify with. The important thing to recognize is that New England has a tremendous capacity for conservation, and rather than inventing large new bureaucracies and totally new organizations, bringing that together to advance conservation is the way forward. There are a number of other elements that need to be achieved. Aggregation is an important tool that has been advanced locally here in Massachusetts and is by groups like the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust and others, and is an effort that the New England Forestry Foundation is actively trying to pursue in western Massachusetts and across New England. There's a need clearly for expanded finance, and really a rethinking of the values that we have and where we put our money. We need to think of conservation as an investment in infrastructure for us and for nature for the future. So in conclusion, I'd like to just say that the Wildlands and Woodlands report is based on science, it's based on history, and it's based on conservation experience. It recognizes that New England is truly the turning point. While history has provided us with a second chance to determine the fate of our futures, we're going to need to act deliberately and with boldness if we're going to conserve our forests, as forest ownership patterns are changing rapidly and forest cover is declining across the region for the first time in more than a century and a half. The authors of this report believe that by drawing on the immense capacity for conservation that exists in the region's organizations, agencies, and landowners, and seizing on new strategies for conservation and its funding, and recognizing the critical local, national, and global need for conservation, that we really can achieve this vision. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for that. I want to invite the 28 or so people who are online now to submit questions for David, and I will also join in as one of the co-authors in answering those questions. We've got one from Tom McAvoy, who asked David the following, and I hope I can get this right. Yes, your numbers on forest cover are correct, as are, I'm sure, your inventory data. But the problem is that on many forests, 80% or more of any given acre resides in 2 or 3 trees. The rest are considered no better than fuel wood or cull. Loggers are constantly lamenting the lack of good wood, but refuse to accept at least some responsibility for the problem. How can we manage forests in a sustainable fashion when, how can we manage forests in a sustainable fashion when when silviculture is driven by stumpage prices? David.
Well, I think there are clearly major constraints on forestry activity across New England. They certainly include the ones that were just mentioned by Tom. But when I show the total amount of timber that's available for harvest or that exists in the region, it doesn't equate to the amount that's available. There are constraints that range from physical to cultural constraints, ownership constraints, small sizes and all. But the current state of New England forests and the value and availability of the products is clearly an important point. And, one of the options that is looming out there, which is both a threat and an opportunity, is the use of our wood products for energy generation, especially for thermal generation, so the use of biomass. And it's long been known and long stated by lots of loggers, foresters, and landowners that if there was a mechanism that allowed more work to be done in the woods, and especially more use of lower quality material, that it would be possible to work long term in a more sustained fashion that would improve the quality of the timber that's standing in the forest. And so I think mechanisms like that include increasing prices for firewood and the potential for especially locally distributed wood-fired heating plants, like the one that's actually proposed here at the Harvard Forest, that would be supplied entirely by wood that would come off of our own land, provide an opportunity to continue to work in our woods and continue to improve the quality of forests and the timber that's growing in them.
David, we have another question from Gary Tabor, who I believe is sending us this question from Bozeman, Montana, and is well known in the large landscape conservation field. Gary asks, why create a conservation vision that is limited to New England and does not include the Adirondacks and the eastern forests of Canada? And if I can jump in first.
Please do.
And then turn it back to you. Gary, you're pointing out something that's absolutely correct, and of course this vision isn't limited to New England. It's simply scoped to tackle the problem here and then dovetail with conservation projects elsewhere. In fact, in the last week, the Canadian Forest Association has announced a historic agreement with First Nations in Canada and the Canadian government and NGOs there to protect something like 72 million hectares of forest land that's involved in habitat for the woodland caribou. I want to warn you not to take that statistic verbatim, but go back on the internet and check the agreement itself. But it's a very large amount of acreage, and it obviously is acreage that's partly connected through the Maritimes in Canada to forests in New England. When we talk about large landscape conservation, we're, of course, leading ourselves into continental scale conservation ideas of the kind that Gary has long advocated in the Yellowstone to Yukon dialogues that he's had in the western part of the United States. Even closer to home to New England, there are now considerations of cross-border collaboration in eastern Maine and western New Brunswick focused on the Acadian forest. So your question is very well placed, and of course we're actively talking to and thinking through how the implications of this vision interleaf with the very productive conservation dialogues that are ongoing in Canada. David, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I could just add just a little bit, which would be that we certainly don't think of this vision as being unique or being isolated or restricted to New England. We are actively, as you suggested, looking to extend it and connect it and compare it with adjoining regions and regions beyond. We started, of course, with Massachusetts because it was an area that the first group of authors felt particularly well positioned to address, and it was only as we expanded to a larger group of authors engaged in a lot more discussion that we felt like scaling up to New England. But we've begun discussions with people essentially all around the country of the application of these types of approaches and similar approaches to other regions, and scaling this and looking at the way these pieces fit together is exactly the direction that we need to go, and the direction that we would hope to advance in collaboration with a lot of other people. So forging these kinds of discussions and moving forward on that is exactly what we're interested in doing.
And I have another question from Steve Brook, and then I want to also encourage the audience. We have time for a number of questions, and we can go beyond the 12 o'clock deadline if we get more questions. Pardon me. Steve Brook asked a two-part question, and David, maybe you want to take the first part, and I'll take a swing at the second part. The first part is, please discuss the role of stewardship in this vision. That is, the monitoring and enforcement of existing easements. And then the second part is, do you feel existing sources of funding are adequate to steward existing conservation lands? So, David, if you want to tackle the first part of that, I'll follow you up.
Yeah, so I think that certainly stewardship, both in terms of management of land and oversight of the way that lands are managed, or the way that the intact nature of conserved lands is maintained is a critical issue, and very clearly it's an issue that the land trust community and conservation community at large has been trying to tackle. I mean, right in our own backyard, we have, a current lawsuit with an abutter where a forest property was trespassed upon. This is a forest property that is protected by a conservation easement, and it's only through the kind of diligent oversight of that type of activity and stewardship of easements that we can actually ensure the viability of this conservation landscape. But there are some very good emerging models for this. I point to organizations like the Vermont Land Trust, which has a phenomenal capacity for stewardship of easements, with both close monitoring and close active engagement with landowners. It takes good resources to do that. It takes good personnel. It takes a lot of advanced documentation on the land itself and follow-up. But the way I view it, because I happen to be a landowner who is followed up with on an annual basis by VLT, I view this as a huge opportunity for landowners to engage regularly with individuals who know an awful lot about both conservation and active management. And so it's a huge way of networking and a huge opportunity to feed more information and help to guide ongoing active stewardship in terms of management on the ground.
So to follow that up with the part of the question about are current levels of funding adequate to the task, certainly we need to augment current levels of funding. We're currently working on that right now with a task force in Massachusetts, looking at new and innovative ways of doing conservation finance for forest conservation. In particular, several methods are coming to be of increasing interest. One that is mentioned in David's comments is aggregation, which is the process of trying to aggregate small distributed parcels of forest land into a larger package that can be appraised and stewarded and also financed at scale and probably much more efficiently and economically than you could do it on a case-by-case basis. So aggregation is something that is been tried in the North Quabbin region of Massachusetts, which is in the neighborhood of the Harvard Forest, and which is increasingly being tried across the region. There's now a Western Massachusetts aggregation project that's ongoing that I think is of considerable interest. Mitigation, both informal and formal, is of interest. I know that the Plum Creek Moosehead Lake project is still in the courts and is being appealed, but the informal or the negotiated, however you want to characterize it, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not trying to characterize it in legal terms, the settlement that has at least been tentatively arrived at, where the proportion of protected lands is 20 times as great as the proportion of developed lands, I think is going in the right direction and is effectively a source of conservation, of funding conservation projects. We're certainly not at the final frontier of conservation finance. There's a terrific amount of work and invention that needs to be done as we go forward. David, for you, I have a question from Catherine Gordon, who asks, how does the Wildlands and Woodlands vision compare with the Forest Futures visioning process that took place in Massachusetts? And she asks, do they complement or compete with one another?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and point. The Forest Futures activity did look broadly at the entire state of Massachusetts and its forests, but and had some recommendations that dealt with the entire state, but most of the emphasis and certainly most of the attention that was provided by state officials, including Secretary Bowles, really addressed just one portion of the state ownership, that was the DCR Forest and Parks lands. The complementary aspects are that we're both thinking in terms of essentially two broad approaches to management, active management for a variety of purposes, including wood products, but habitat management and recreation, and then essentially passive management, or allowing reserve status to hold and really a a minimum amount of direct human activity. So in that sense, they're strongly complementary. I mean, in the original Wildlands and Woodlands report for Massachusetts, we suggested that the majority of reserves in a state like Massachusetts might be situated on public lands. We did that because public lands are large blocks of forest and provide an opportunity to support landscape level reserves. They also provide an opportunity to play off of some of the abutting ownerships that could extend these reserves considerably. We had as a target goal in that paper 50% of the state lands as reserves, but we pointed out that, and we strongly encouraged that people in Massachusetts and agencies in Massachusetts think very strongly or actively about increasing active management on private and public lands. And we pointed out, therefore, that even if you established reserves on 50% of state lands, that you could actually increase the amount of harvesting and generate more wood products and have a larger portion of the total area under active management than has been the case historically. So there are some complementary aspects. The big difference is that we really focus in on private lands as being the key, and we really focus in on conserving private lands as being the preeminent concern above and beyond all other concerns for forests. And that includes the nitty-gritty of how they're managed, and it includes the threats that come from many other non-human directions.
I have one more question right now, and I think we will, after that, make some concluding comments and then close the session for today. We have a question from Mike Speltz, who asks another two-part question. The first part of that question is, please comment on the relative roles of conservation as now practiced by NGOs and agencies and regulation. So the relative roles of conservation and regulation. And beyond this business-as-usual approach to conservation, what role do Eric Freifogel's ideas about land ownership and stewardship play? To what extent is it feasible in New England to rewrite, so to speak, the rules of land tenure? So let's try the first part of that question first, which is, can you make a comment on the relative roles of conservation and regulation, which is an increasingly discussed topic in conservation circles today?
So let me begin on that, and then you can follow up, Jim. You know, as we were writing this report, a number of the authors, including people like Rob Lowenholm up in Maine and Lloyd Erland, Dave Kittredge here, pointed out that if we applied existing policies more evenly and effectively, we would greatly strengthen conservation in the region. And so we certainly did include that point and the potential for developing new policies and new regulations. But critically, those authors especially felt that before we started writing new policies and regulations, it was important to strengthen the ability to enforce existing ones. I think everyone feels very strongly that active conservation, through whether it's primarily through the establishment of easements or through fee purchases, is a critical element of what we're talking about, but that certainly there will be some new approaches to both accomplishing that at scale and thinking about that in terms of the way that landowners and societies view forests. And I think that that's an absolutely critical element, that we need to value forests more as the local especially, but also global benefit that they serve.
I'd just like to add that central to this vision, as I understand it, is the fact that the public, the private, and the nonprofit sector continually, in old ways and in new ways, are going to need to interact with one another. This is not a task that is the responsibility of one sector or the other. That said, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to try to comment on Eric Freifogel's ideas about land ownership and tenure, but I would say that the toolbox that we have even today has a lot of different permutations that are still being worked out, and I think have applicability both in the United States and, as we've said on other sessions of this Internet broadcast series, in places as far away as China and Chile and even in Africa. So I'm not sure that we need a whole new system of land tenure as much as we need to use the tools that we have now in creative ways to do conservation at a scale that's commensurate with the challenges, particularly related to climate change, that we face today. So, David, with that, I want to close with two things and give you one more chance to comment. The first thing I want to do is to give a special call out for Jim Cooney, who has been very meticulous and perseverant in taking care of all the technical needs of these Internet broadcasts now for 2 years. Jim is taking a summer sabbatical where he is not going to go and lay on the beach, but rather he's traveling to Tanzania, where he will be working in an orphanage and building new water sanitation systems. So he's literally going to be turning thought into action, and we wish him well and congratulate him on his journey and his determination to make the world a little bit better place. The second thing that I want to do is point out that if you want to look at the Wildlands and Woodlands report itself and the remarkable amount of press coverage that it's been getting in recent days and the way that this idea will continue to develop over time, then I would direct you to the website that is now appearing on your screen, www.wildlandsandwoodlands.org. It's got the report. It's got quite a bit of information about the report on it. And I know that it will continue to be refined and enlarged and made richer and richer over time. So please visit that site and join us if you're in New England to help to realize this vision. David, let me as happened the other night, give you the last word and ask you to make any concluding comment that you might want to make about the vision and the way that you see it rolling out over time.
Let me just conclude by saying that I've been asked many times how the authors will support this activity into the future, and I'd say that every one of the authors is actively engaged in research, education, and outreach activities that are kind of critical to advancing this and other conservation visions and activities, whether that's scientific, looking at the way that carbon is moving into and out of our forests, or it's in the policy and financial and economic realms. So although we are not the individuals and the groups that are going to be actively conserving land, we are behind this effort 100%. And then secondly, I think that there are huge opportunities, even with existing finances, to restructure the way that we're allocating our resources, whether that's personnel or money, that could greatly advance this activity, because I think it is so critical. And I do recognize that there will be the need for additional resources that I think can only come when we recognize how important this asset is, what it means to us today, and what it will certainly mean for us in the future. So thanks.
All right, with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Remind you that in several days you will be able to access the recording of this session on the Government Innovators website. And I want to wish you all a great summer, and we will be back with you in the fall of this year to continue the series on innovation in the field of conservation and in conservation finance. Thank you very much, and have a good day.